Multi-green, building attainable, sustainable, and tech-enabled multifamily real estate through impact investing.
Welcome to the Multi-Green Podcast. I'm your host, Randy Norton, and today we'll be speaking with Director of the Construction Industry Institute at the University of Texas, Hook 'em Horns, Dr. Stephen Mulva. His work focuses on performance and productivity within construction, engineering, and project management. Today, we are going to discuss waste in construction, technology in construction, and high-volume rollout. Enjoy our conversation. Stephen, thanks for being with us today. I'm really hoping that we can talk about three topics that you and I have had much exchange around. Number one is project waste. Number two would be high-volume rollout. And number three would be the digitization in the construction industry. And we can do those in any order you think is best. But Stephen, take it off and take it from the top.
Sure. Thanks, Randy. I'm super happy to be here with you today. There's so much great things going on in the capital project space. CII's been knee-deep in this for almost 40 years, but I just think with the trends in digitalization and everything that's going on right now, we're at a kind of point of inflection in this industry. And I think the time is right to really make some major step changes in how projects are planned and designed and constructed. And I think that's going to pay huge dividends for housing and the attainment of housing and really being able to sort of have a correction, I'll say, in the cost of these kinds of facilities.
Stephen, at Multi-Green, there's three things we're trying to do well: construct attainable, sustainable, and tech-enabled multifamily homes. And it seems like a lot of this is around project finance and capital projects. And in fact, we're viewing this as just one giant capital project. From the topics of waste and high-volume rollout and digitization, where do we begin?
I think the waste topic is a good place to start. We have identified that about 41% of the cost of a large capital project is truly waste. It doesn't go into the planning, design, or construction, the materials. It's things like extra risk protection, unnecessary insurance. One of the things we found is that actually projects in many cases are overinsured by a factor of 4 or 5. And so when you start to unbundle this, we call that the commercial model or reinventing the business model of construction. It's something that, frankly, people haven't looked at very much. Most of the time, when we look at improvement in the capital project space, we talk about work process or people or technology. And really, the fundamental business model, people take for granted. So there are going to be contracts, and those are just going to be led, and then the lawyers get involved. And essentially, that's where a lot of the cost comes from. So there's probably 15 different sources of extra cost that you'll see here. The biggest two are risk and trade credit. And the easiest way to describe risk is just when you have 100 different companies involved in one of these large projects, they add contingency and management reserve because they're uncertain what may happen. So sometimes people think, a large hurricane could hit this project. And so because of if that happens, we'll have to add contingency dollars and management reserve for this. Well, if everybody's doing that for the same risk event, those risk dollars start multiplying. The other big cost waste that we see in projects is something that we call trade credit. And that has to do with the fact that if you complete work for me, my contract with you might say that I have 75 days to pay it, 90 days to pay it. The average is 75 days for suppliers to pay or for subcontractors to get paid. And what that forces is everybody higher in the supply chain is basically being banked by the people lower in the supply chain. So the lower people are the bankers. And so there's been a study in the United Kingdom that was done, and it said on average, people are adding 5% to their cost structure at every level. And on these big projects, big multifamily projects, not excluded, you'll have 8 to 10 layers of supply chain. And if you're adding 5% at every layer just because you're going to be paid late, that compounds. It turns into a very large number. So those are the two big big sources, and we've been able to figure out how to attack both of them. And the answer is through technology. Largely, we can use blockchain, we can use some other technologies to really add transparency to both the risk and the trade credit problem.
Stephen, before we get into technology, let's convert this 41% of waste, this relative number, into an absolute number. So if the project is a $100 million project, let's say it costs $100 million, and let's say 20 million of it is soft costs and 80 million of it is hard costs. What would that 41% number translate into in a dollar figure?
It's $41 million of money that you potentially can take out, and your total project cost would go from $100 million down to $59 million. We can't totally make it frictionless though, and I think the better way to describe it is we probably can get rid of a third of the project cost. So now your $100 million project, I think, there's a really strong chance we can do it for $66 or $67 million. And we should be able to do that within the next year. Right now, this stuff is not rocket science. A lot of the learnings and the principles are very applicable from other industries that have done it: aerospace, high tech, automotive sectors. We can bring that in, and that's what we're doing right now at CII.
Now, this 41% of waste, was that before COVID or after COVID? And with the disruption of supply chain now, what is happening to this waste number or waste percentage?
No, this is a great point. These studies were done prior to COVID. I think, if anything, that the amount of waste has gone up. People have added, again, more contingency, more management reserve as a buffer for the supply chain problems that they've been experiencing. We see that all across the industry, difficulty in getting materials, and it's component materials that go in the finished product. So, at these 8 to 10 layers of the supply chain, they're being disrupted at every one of those layers. And so that's probably only adding to the waste. It would be an interesting study to see where the 41% is today, given everything that we've experienced through the pandemic.
So that waste number just continues to get bigger, it sounds like.
It does. And then, all the different factors in here, and, not all projects have foreign exchange, but rework is going up, as the experienced workers retire, the challenges with interoperability, surety and bonding expenses, those continue to go up. Crime, fraud, counterfeiting, this is another problem with the supply chain. You got a lot of counterfeit goods entering. The purchase orders, the RFPs, the bidding process, that's adding more and more. Duplicate contingencies, management reserves, insurance coverage, cost of claims. Just there's things besides just the risk and the trade credit, those 9 or so things that I just rattled off, those are all going up as well. At some point, the majority of what a project costs, if we don't control this somehow, the majority of the project cost is going to be things that don't go into the planning, design, or construction.
That's great insight. Thanks for sharing that. So blockchain, BIM, and other technologies are going to come into play here. I'm less familiar with blockchain, but certainly I am familiar with the contract environment and the importance of that contract environment. But one time I heard one of my professors say the two greatest technologies are finance and the legal environment here in the United States. And that is what has enabled the capital markets to thrive here in the United States. When you talk about technology, can you expand on that?
Sure. I think it's really the transparency that's provided by some of these technologies. So, you've got to have a lot of companies and individuals come together. There's a lot of interfaces there. So at one level, technology really enables those interfaces to happen. We still have a challenge with interoperability. That is, how does the 3D design model work and interface with everybody else who's doing design? So we have that, but then we have the interface challenges of the companies working together from a business level perspective. So getting that under control is something that we work on quite a bit. The transparency, though, on the business side, and we're using blockchain a lot for this, the best example I can illustrate for you is just say there's 20 individuals and they belong to a country club, and they're all wealthy individuals. They want to understand who's the wealthiest, but they're unwilling to go to the front of the room and write their net worth on a blackboard. And so what they do is they anonymously submit their net worth onto essentially a blockchain. So it's anonymous. They say, I'm worth so much, somebody else does the same. What results is a list. Here's the 20 individuals, number 1 to number 20, wealthiest to least wealthy. These people can look at this list and they can say, oh, look, I'm number 7. I know that I'm a third of the way down the list. I know number 1 is worth X and I know number 20 is worth Y. And they can see that. So there's transparency to this, but without revealing how much money they actually have. If you take that into the capital projects context, what you've got is essentially the risk. And so you can have the 100 different companies that are coming together on your project. They can anonymously show their price curves. And people think of price as, one number, but actually it's not. So when your mechanical contractor who's going to do the HVAC system says, well, this is going to cost $10 million for this big project, what he or she's actually saying is, well, there's a range from about 9 million up to about 15 million, but I think the most likely number is going to be 10 million. And so we could come a little underneath that, or we could go above it. And if it gets really catastrophically bad, that's when you get into the 12, 13, $15 million range. Well, if they disclose this curve on a blockchain, we have the ability to aggregate all the curves together. And what results is an overall curve for the entire project. And it has a very long tail. And that's the danger for an owner, is that they say, well, the most likely is $100 million, but it could be, if everything goes catastrophically wrong, it could be $130 million. And our investors are unwilling to put that kind of money into this project because it might even be uneconomic. And that's kind of the problem that we're dealing with. So the blockchain, the technology is starting to solve this problem because of the transparency that it can provide on the financial condition of everybody who's in that ecosystem.
Are there any software examples? Are there any vendors that you could have us recommend as listeners?
I think there's not a lot of blockchain applications in construction just yet. A lot of the software providers and so you think about Ethereum and Hyperledger and then even specific applications, like a lot of the applications we're working with are with companies like Prairie Dog and Data Gumbo and Simba Chain. Well, Simba Chain, for example, is a blockchain platform, and you can use that for all kinds of different applications. So what we're trying to do now is add different layers or different specific types of applications in the construction world using these kinds of platforms. So I think the platforms are good, they're out there, but the individual use cases are, and people are doing things with this, I'm not saying, but it's still kind of in its infancy. And we don't have applications for everything that we're doing in construction. Right now, there's next month, there's a pilot application for ready-mix concrete. So there's a large general contractor that's building a big data center in Texas and for a client of theirs, and they're going to use this blockchain application for the ready-mix deliveries to make sure that they have full transparency on how many truckloads of concrete they received, when they received it, and there can be attributes to the quality of that concrete. There can be attributes to who supplied all the ingredients, so the sand and the cement and the aggregates and the admixtures. And this is a really great thing from a standpoint of because of that transparency, you can not only eliminate some of the waste associated with fraud and being overcharged, but you can actually go back for the life cycle and you can make sure that it had the structural strength. You can look at the environmental properties of the concrete itself and when it was produced and how many tons of CO2 were released into the atmosphere because of the production of the concrete. And so there's multiple dimensions that this can go in. I think we're just at the tip of the iceberg in terms of what all the applications are in our industry.
Wonderful. And all of that metadata can get into the BIM model. Can you maybe expand on the connection and correlation with all of this ingredient and procurement with maybe the asset model and the byproduct of a BIM model?
Yeah, that's really a great insight that you're bringing. I think people still treat the BIM model as like the design artifact. It's instead of just being drawings on a sheet of E-size paper or something, they just still treat it as the design. No, it actually is the model. That's where the word digital twin comes from, that this is the real project. It's just in a virtual sense. And so because of that, people don't think about the model having weight. We could actually weigh the entire project, and we could say this project weighs 400 metric tons in the and people say, well, no, that's just a representation on the screen. You have to get your mind in a mindset that no, it's real. And because of that, this has mass, it has thermal properties, it has everything that you can think of. And that's where we can start adding a lot of the attributes and also the business attributes. How much did this cost? When is the delivery date? You can shade the digital twin based on delivery date. And that's one of the things we get into at CII as well, is what's the path of construction here? And if a material's late, if a part of the project isn't designed, can we resequence that? Can we use machine learning and AI techniques and resequence that path of construction basically every night, so we can keep our crews busy, so that we don't have, and that's another waste, is poor productivity and poor planning. And so that's one of the things that we work on as well, is making sure that our crews can keep working all the time. So that's another way we can use the digital twin. But people have to get past that mentality that it's just a pretty picture, that no, actually it is the real thing. It just happens to be living in your computer.
So Stephen, let's go back to that 41% of waste number. Did that include labor? Did it include materials? And did that include finance?
So the two biggest parts of that are, again, this trade credit and I would say the loss of productivity. So the loss of productivity is the thing that we've typically addressed. It's about almost a quarter of that 41%. So it's 9 or 10% is this loss of productivity. But the trade credit is actually the largest chunk. It's more than a quarter of the 41%. And that is just those late payments again.
Any other technologies that you want to talk about in trying to make construction more efficient and delivering more attainable housing in the world today?
I think a lot of the technologies in the short term are going to be if we can probably replace human labor. We have a really shortage of craft professionals in the industry. The more that we can do, when we call PPMOF, pre-assembled, prefabricated, modularized, or offsite fabricated, we know that the productivity rate or the unit rate is much better once we're not on the site. We're not exposed to the rain and the dust and the snow and the heat when we're working in a climate controlled environment. So one of the things that we're trying to do there is take a lot of the work off site to reduce the number of craft professionals that are already in short supply. Going forward, I think there's whole sections of the construction industry that are really ripe for major automation to come in and take place. For example, road building. We know how to build roads basically without workers. Long stretches of highway, the earth moving, the paving operations, all of that can be done completely without human operators. And the nature of work is actually changing, because it's now the people who are involved are programming these machines, maintaining these machines. The number of overall people we need are much less. What that does is allows us to work with more productivity day in and day out.
So we've talked about waste. 41% of all construction costs, of all installation cost, is waste. We've talked about technology. What about delivery? There's got to be better ways to deliver and construct these assets, in particular, the multifamily assets and property types that Multi-Green is pursuing.
Yeah, this is a great point. I think a lot of times people, let me go back just to the word project. So project means temporary and unique. And the unique aspect causes people to get lured into this trap of, well, everything's, the British would say bespoke. Everything is so unique that we have to custom design, custom plan, and there's no ability to capture on the learning curve. That is the repetitive nature of construction. There are a few examples out there, and we call that high volume rollout, that people have gotten into over time, where you have scope similar facilities, and the only thing that you're really changing is maybe the location every location is subject to different geotechnical considerations, maybe different building codes as well. Certainly local jurisdictions, planning and zoning boards factor in here as well. But the scope can be similar. So you think about McDonald's, right? You can have McDonald's all over the country. You recognize that brand, but it can be in Oklahoma or Nevada or New York, and you still recognize it as McDonald's. So there are things that are scope similar, and there are some parts that are different. The more that you can capture on those similarities and build on that learning curve and that repetition, you can really drive these costs down. So that's one thing that I've studied throughout my career. Actually, that's what I did my PhD in, was studying companies who had done these high volume rollouts. And the one that I probably worked on the most was Walmart. And over the span of probably 15 to 20 years, they did this high volume rollout for 3,500 super centers. And this is the conversion that they went through as they added a grocery store to the traditional Walmart. And that's what defines a super center. But they were opening 450 of these across the US every single year. And so when you're doing more than one a day, you have to have a production system capable of planning and designing and constructing these things. In fact, there was one Saturday, one of these years, and this is sort of late 1990s, early 2000s, that they grand opened one Walmart supercenter in every single state and all the territories. So I think there were 56 stores that grand opened on a single Saturday, just to prove that the management capabilities that were brought to bear here. And what that did is it continued to lower the price point. I think that they got to a point where they were building for, I think it was $17 a square foot. And that's just a number that people can't even fathom today. And even if you adjust it for inflation, I mean, you're still talking about numbers that are $30 or $40 a square foot.
That's incredible. How could multi-green benefit from minimizing waste, implementing better technologies, and eventually figuring out a program for high volume rollout? We're in the multifamily industry. We're in the multifamily asset class. And it seems like it's the most inefficient property type in the world.
Yeah, so I think one of the lessons here is we call it prototypical design or kit of parts. And so you can actually, and this is something that we've done in CII research with shipbuilding. Kit of parts was you can design high design. People will get mistaken about like there's not high quality or high design. This is just the opposite. In fact, the only way to lower the costs is to rapidly increase the quality of the design. And so this is the thing that Walmart invested in. I mean, it used to be their drawing set was probably 2 or 3 inches thick. They started designing super centers and building them with 56 sheets. That was it, because they invested so much into the quality of the design. What it did, though, is they separated the store into components and chunks, and they did the same in shipbuilding. And you can mix and match these components. And if you ever go into a Walmart, you'll notice that sometimes the auto repair section or the garden section are in different parts of the building, because they could kind of add them on the back or the side depending on the piece of property that they bought. And so the lesson for multi-green could be just that, is that by investing in the quality of the design, but making it sort of this component kit of parts approach, that you can put different parts of the facility together and then rapidly roll it out. And there's probably 18 different management techniques that go into high volume rollout. It's everything from how do you get the plans through the planning and zoning? We figured out how to do that in 8 days instead of 80 days, I think was the national average at the time. And so some of those are just pretty simple techniques. Others were like change management, controlling, if you're going to build 10,000 multifamily units in a year or in a couple of years, you have to be very disciplined on change management. And so one of the things that Walmart did, for example, is I think they went more than a decade without making a single change on one of their projects, because they had the discipline to only make the change in the model. And in our case now that we call the digital twin. So they said, whatever it is, that's what we're building. It's much cheaper to renovate it or change it later than actually during the actual construction of the project.
Fascinating. Well, I love the story of high volume rollout. I want to implement it. at Multigreen. How long would it take for us to get to a point where we're successfully deploying high volume rollout?
I think the technology is here today to do that relatively soon. I mean, you're talking a matter of months. It changes the management mindset or the philosophy that you're going to pursue. One of the things that Walmart did was the building was an economic engine. The building wasn't a building. And I think, how do I say that better? The architects and the construction, and they think they're building a building. And one of the things that Sam Walton instilled in some of the main architects that I worked with who did this high volume rollout was, this is an economic engine. This is to make people's lives better. That's why we're doing this. And so we put this together in a way that's high quality, that adds to people's lives. The technology is there to do it, but I think you have to think of it economically. And one of the ways that they did that is in a program in high volume rollout. Probably the biggest management principle was this idea of reslotting. And so if you think about opening one store every day, well, what will happen is you could get way behind the curve, like the planning and zoning in Los Angeles, for example, that could extend, an extra 60 days. So instead of trying to work overtime, and do all these things to crash the schedule, what they would do is accept it, and they would move it down 60 slots down. Because it's easier to pick up one day on 59 projects than it is to pick up 60 days on that one project in Los Angeles. Most architects and project managers don't think of it that way. But high volume rollout depends on you managing the portfolio, and you make moves on each of these projects to keep that portfolio intact and to drive the financial results and the economic results that you're looking for.
I love that idea that the building is an economic engine. And the whole thesis of Multigreen is to bring attainability, sustainability, and tech enablement to our residents. And there's many things that can be bolted on in regards to a cost of living or an overall benefit to these residents when you start thinking that way. And I firmly believe that 5 or 10 years from now, the way that appraisals are done are going to be fundamentally different. I think that there will be a qualitative component that is more heavily weighted to what other services your property can provide or what other parts of this economic engine can be measured. And I think a big part of that is going to be the digital infrastructure and the digital amenities that these residents will benefit from, which you can only do if you go way deep into the design and get involved very early on in the process.
I think one of the other opportunities, and one of the reasons I'm so fascinated with what you're doing at Multigreen, is it's very much a life cycle perspective. You're thinking about how's this building going to perform and how the resident's going to interact with it, not just the day they move in, but 5, 10, 20 years down the road. And that's also an economic perspective that I think can pay huge dividends here as well.
Stephen, is there a way that we could document this idea of attainability or the waste measurement just in our multifamily projects at Multigreen? How could we document, over the next 5 or 10 years that our cost curve actually went down and our product delivery went up?
I think it's, the lesson of high volume rollout is just that, is that over time, the price point kept coming down for Walmart, and technology drove a lot of that. And so they measured that. They actually measured it in something they called revenue weeks. And so what were the total weeks of revenue available when they grand opened a store? Then they would also look at it over time as well in terms of new store sales or existing store. So that's kind of an economic measure. I think you could get a little broader and deeper than that. And you could look at sort of the overall facility performance. You could look at post-occupancy and long-term customer satisfaction numbers as part of that as well. And so that's where the commitment at Multigreen to be a partner in people's lives and a positive influence on their families. I think you can actually measure that and continue to work that into the overall future programs that the company gets into.
Stephen, we're asking all of our participants on the podcast this year how they would define attainability. What does attainability mean to you, and how would you define it?
I think in the context of multifamily, it's that you can attain the lifestyle that you want to lead at a price point that you can afford. And the role that we can play in capital projects to enable that to happen and our ability to have that happen for people, it's probably greater than any other part of their life. Their housing is typically the most expensive part of a family's financial or their budget. And I think, if we can really lower that overall life cycle cost for people and have a high standard and high quality of living, that's what makes it attainable.
Well, thanks for being with us today, Stephen. My hope is that you can help me identify the key metrics and the KPIs that I need to be measuring for a successful deployment of high volume rollout.
Absolutely. I'd love to help you with that. No problem.
I look forward to spending a couple of weeks with you in Austin this coming January.
That'll be great. We look forward to having you here.
Thanks so much for your time today.
Sure.
Thank you for listening. Join us as we build 40,000 attainable, sustainable, and tech-enabled multifamily homes by 2030. And if you like the content you're hearing, hit the subscribe button. Follow us at Think Multigreen and sign up to learn more at www.multi.green.